Hey friends, tonight we're stepping back into ancient Rome, somewhere most history books leave alone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There's something strangely calming about knowing others are listening to these same quiet stories at the same time, even from different places, in different nights of the world. So if you're still awake with me, you can simply settle in now. Let the lights soften a little, maybe let the room feel a bit heavier, a bit quieter. And let's ease into tonight's quiet hour together. Tonight you are not in your bedroom anymore. You are somewhere older. The stone is cold. The air smells of cypress, resin, and bread, and something else, something you will identify shortly. A city is already awake around you. Carts are moving. Someone is laughing too loudly for this hour. Welcome to Rome, not the Rome of the history books, not the marble forums and the triumphant generals. The other Rome, the one that was alive every day in the ordinary dark before the speeches started. You are walking through the Suburra at dawn. This is not the nice part of the city. It never was. The Suburra is Rome's oldest neighborhood, a dense canyon of 6-story apartment buildings called insulae, stacked so close together that the upper floors almost touch across the street. Laundry hangs between them, the ground floor shops are just opening. A baker is already working, you can smell it. You follow the street south toward the sound of running water. The fullonica is on the corner. You would know it from a block away, not from any sign, but from the sound of it. 20 or 30 people. Conversation, occasionally laughter. You push open the door. The room is long and rectangular, cut from stone. Along 2 walls there is a continuous bench, maybe knee height, with holes cut into it at regular intervals. Perhaps 20 holes, perhaps 30, depending on the building. Beneath each hole, a channel of water flows constantly, fed from the aqueduct, draining somewhere downstream. There are no doors. There are no partitions between the holes. There are no partitions of any kind. The men sitting along the bench are not whispering. Several of them appear to be in the middle of quite involved discussions. One is gesturing with his hands. Another is eating something wrapped in cloth. You sit down. Nobody looks at you, because nobody needed to. This is perfectly normal. The public latrine, the fullonica, was not a place Romans tolerated. It was a place Romans enjoyed. This requires a moment. The fullonica was one of the primary social spaces of the Roman city. Alongside the Bathhouse and the Forum, it was where you ran into your neighbors, caught up on neighborhood news, and conducted the low-level commerce of daily life. You went there in the morning because it was on the way to work. You went there in the afternoon because it was warm. There were no stalls, there was no privacy, there was no expectation of privacy. The concept did not apply here. And the records suggest something else that, by any modern standard, should be impossible. Some accounts describe men bringing food into the fullonica, not just snacks at the entrance, but eating at the bench itself. This detail appears in multiple sources and is usually explained away. We will come back to it, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part is the instrument you would find on a small ledge or hanging from a hook at roughly every 3rd seat along the bench. It was a stick. On the end of the stick was a small sea sponge. There was one of these for everyone. You shared it. The xylospongium, the spongon, a stick, was the Roman answer to a problem every civilization has to solve. Theirs was communal, reusable, available to anyone who needed it, which was everyone, which was the point. Between uses, the sponge rested in a small channel of running salt water, or occasionally vinegar. This was the cleaning mechanism. Whether it worked in any meaningful hygienic sense is a question the Romans did not think to ask. The sponge was wet. The sponge was available. You used it, you rinsed it, you replaced it. The man next to you did the same. There was a small channel of water running along the floor at your feet as well. This one was for your hands. The forca charged admission in some neighborhoods, usually a small coin, less than the cost of bread. In others, it was free. The free ones were generally busier, and the water was changed less often, and the conversation was louder. This is consistent with what you would expect. Attendants worked the forca in shifts. Their job was to manage the water flow, replace the sponges when they became unusable, collect the admission coin, and begin hire. Bend establishments, bring small towels. The attendant's position was not prestigious. It was steady work. In Rome, steady work was its own argument. The wealthier citizens had chamber pots at home, emptied by slaves into the street or into the waste collectors' carts that made rounds before dawn. Some of them still used the forca anyway. It was, in some neighborhoods, the place to be seen. A senator was not above it. Several sources record prominent men conducting what amounted to client meetings at the bench, obligations repaid, favors arranged, names noted. The walls in some excavated forca show traces of graffiti, names, small drawings. One wall in Herculaneum preserves what appears to be a list of debts owed by a man named Lucius, with a small commentary on his character written beside it. It was the notice board of the neighborhood. The water ran underneath it, and honestly, after a while, you probably stopped noticing the smell. Here is the part most history books quietly leave out. The forca was not, to the Roman mind, a compromise. It was not a public amenity that people used because they had no other choice. It was infrastructure in the truest sense, engineered, maintained, sometimes architecturally elaborate. Several forcae in Pompeii and Ostia show traces of painted walls, decorated floors. One has a small niche that may have held a statuette. Romans decorated their public latrines. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Not the communal bench, you could work up to that. The decorated walls, the fact that someone looked at a room with 30 open holes and thought, this space deserves a painting. That someone was not wrong. A man we will call Marcus, a fuller's apprentice, 3rd Street off the main road, working since before dawn, arrives at the forca at the corner near the Subura market just after the 2nd hour. He has been on his feet since dark. He sits down. He nods to the man beside him, a grain merchant he recognizes from the neighborhood. They have a brief conversation about a cart that blocked the road yesterday. Marcus stays longer than strictly necessary, because the forca in winter is one of the warmest rooms he will enter all day. This is the explanation for the food. Beneath some forca, particularly in the northern provinces, where the engineering records are better preserved, archaeologists have found evidence of hypocaust systems. The same underfloor heating used in bathhouses, fed by small furnaces. The running water channel also generated heat. The room was enclosed. It was, by the standards of a city where most apartments had no heating at all, genuinely comfortable. Vendors set up near the entrance, hot food, bread, small cups of heated wine. You did not bring food inside because you were careless. You brought food inside because it was warm, and you were going to be sitting for a few minutes anyway, and the bread was right there. Comfort wasn't disgusting. It was practical, and the Romans were nothing if not practical about the body. They had built an empire on logistics. The forca was a logistics problem. Tens of thousands of people, concentrated in a city, producing a predictable daily need, and they had solved it with stone, running water, and a small sponge. It wasn't privacy they were missing. Privacy, as a concept applied to bodily functions, had simply not been invented yet. What they had instead was company and warmth, and occasionally someone to talk to about the cart that blocked the road. Disease wasn't their concern. Efficiency was, The water ran, the sponge was there. The man next to you had opinions about the grain shortage and was not shy about sharing them. This was healthcare. This was infrastructure. This was Tuesday morning in Rome. Rome designed its waste systems with remarkable precision. Every insula had a designated waste point. Every neighborhood had its forica. Every forica had its channel, its sponge, its attendant noting the morning's flow. The Romans applied this same precision, this same patient, bureaucratic attention to the body's daily requirements, to what went into the body as well. And the results were no less communal, and no less, by modern standards, difficult to explain at a dinner party. The next thing Rome gave you was a condiment. It was everywhere. It was on everything. It smelled considerably worse than the forica. Welcome to the edge of town. This is where Rome kept the things it needed, but did not want to smell. The tanneries, the bone, boilers, the fullers with their vat work and their particular chemistry. And here, on the southern road out of the city, behind a low wall and under a wooden roof that does nothing to contain what is happening beneath it, the Garum factory. You are going to smell it before you see it. The vats are wide and shallow, cut from stone or fired clay, set in rows under the open sky. Each one is full. The contents are difficult to describe with precision. Fish, or what was fish some weeks ago. Mackerel, mostly, anchovies, sometimes tuna offcuts, the parts the market did not sell. All of it packed in layers with coarse salt, in ratios the factory workers have memorized and do not write down. On top of each vat, in the better establishments, a weighted wooden board keeps the surface from drawing flies. It does not entirely work. The mixture has been here for some time. In summer, the Mediterranean heat does most of the work. The proteins break down, the oils separate. The salt draws out the liquid and then suspends it in something that is no longer quite liquid and no longer quite solid. It moves when you disturb it, with a patience that suggests it has somewhere to be, and is in no hurry to get there. At a certain point, weeks, sometimes months, the factory workers strain the top layer through a fine cloth. What runs through is amber, colored, translucent, faintly luminous in certain light. This is garum. You are going to put it on your dinner, not reluctantly, not as a last resort. You are going to reach for it the way a person reaches for salt, which is to say automatically, without thinking, because the food is in front of you and the garum is there. Garum was the dominant condiment of the Roman world, not one of several options, not a regional specialty. The dominant condiment present in recipes across every province of the empire, referenced in cookbooks and medical texts and private letters and military supply records. If a Roman was eating a prepared meal, there was likely garum on it or in it. Apicius, the closest thing Rome had to a recipe collection, uses garum in the overwhelming majority of its dishes. Sweet dishes, savory dishes, dishes made with honey and wine and fruit, all of them, garum on all of them. It was also used as medicine, a dab on the tongue for digestive complaints, applied to wounds as an antiseptic, prescribed by physicians for conditions ranging from dog bites to ear infections. The logic was consistent with Roman medicine generally, which is to say it had its own internal coherence, and would give a modern doctor considerable pause. But here is the detail that the records mention and most histories move past quickly. The finest garum, the variety reserved for the wealthiest tables, the kind that appeared in the houses of senators and at imperial dinners, was transported in a very specific kind of container. Sealed airtight, made from a particular material chosen for its impermeability. We will come back to the containers. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was where else you found garum, and on what. The production of garum was a serious industry with serious geography. Roman law, or more precisely, municipal custom backed by social pressure, kept garum factories outside city walls. The smell was the reason. Even by Roman standards, which had already accommodated tanneries and fullers and open drainage channels, the smell of an active garum vat in summer was considered excessive. Several writers mention it. Seneca, who lived near a factory briefly, complained with a specificity that suggests genuine suffering. But outside the city was not far from the city. The factories operated on coastal roads, in harbor districts, in the industrial zones that ringed every major Roman town. Workers walked to them in the morning and walked home in the evening carrying the smell with them, which their families had presumably learned to accept. The best garum came from specific fish and specific coasts. Garum from the factories at Gades, modern Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Spain, was considered the finest available, traded across the entire Mediterranean in sealed ceramic amphorae stamped with the producer's mark. A good amphora of Gadatanian garum cost roughly the equivalent of a week's wages for a skilled laborer. There were grades. The dregs left after straining, called a lek, were cheaper and saltier, and used primarily by the poor and by soldiers on campaign. Military supply records from the northern provinces show a lek appearing in troop rations alongside grain and olive oil. The legions of Britain were eating fermented Spanish fish paste. This held the empire together in ways the history books do not always emphasize. There was also a variety called muria, made primarily from tuna, darker and thicker, favored in certain regional cuisines. And liquamen, which some scholars argue was a separate product and others argue was simply another name for garum, depending on the province and the century. The Romans argued about this too. They had opinions about their fermented fish sauce the way people now have opinions about wine. Regional distinctions, vintage years, producers whose reputation outlasted their own lifetimes. It was a condiment. It was also a culture, and here is the part that most historians quietly skip. Garum did not smell to the Roman palate the way it smells to us. This sounds like a dodge. It isn't. Fermentation science is clear on this. The finished product, properly aged, properly strained, the clear amber liquid, smells and tastes quite different from the vat it came from. Food historians who have reconstructed Roman garum describe it as intensely savory, deeply umami, closer to a very good Southeast Asian fish sauce than to anything rotting. The Romans were not eating something disgusting and tolerating it. They were eating something delicious. The process to get there was simply harder to be near. A cook in a prosperous household on the Aventine Hill is preparing the evening meal. She has access to the good garum, not the finest grade, which is for the dining room, but the second, tier variety kept in the kitchen, in a wide, mouthed ceramic jar with a cloth tied over the top. She uses it the way a modern cook uses salt, a splash into the braised leeks, a measure into the sauce for the roasted pork, a smaller amount stirred into the honeyed wine reduction that will go over the pears. She does not think about it. It is simply what the food requires. In the dining room, the host has brought out something different for his guests, a smaller vessel, sealed with a stopper rather than a cloth. The garum inside is paler, almost golden, and the smell, even at this distance, even in a room with candles and flowers and roasting meat, is different. Quieter, more precise. This garum traveled in lead. The finest grade, the variety from the best Gadatanian factories, the kind that appeared at senatorial tables and at the better imperial dinners, was sometimes transported in containers lined with lead or in lead vessels outright. Lead was impermeable. It did not react with the fish oils. It sealed perfectly. It kept the product stable on a sea voyage from Spain to Ostia, to Rome, in a way that's ceramic, with its small variations in porosity. sometimes could not, and lead, as the Romans did not know and would not have found useful to know, leached, slowly, consistently, into the garum, into the food it seasoned, into the bodies of the people who could afford it. The wealthy Romans who prided themselves on the quality of their table were receiving, with every carefully seasoned dish, a small and reliable dose of lead. It did not kill quickly. It killed the way good garum tasted quietly, over time, in very good company. Luxury wasn't comfort. Sometimes it was just a slower version of the alternative. Rome understood its body with great confidence. It had opinions about digestion, about the humors, about which foods produced which temperaments, about what the body needed and when. It had a condiment that was simultaneously a seasoning, a medicine, and, for its wealthiest consumers, a quiet poison administered with excellent manners. And when something went wrong, when the fish sauce had not, in fact, resolved the digestive complaint, when the wound was not healing, when the tooth was simply not going to survive, Rome had a professional for that too. He also cut your hair. He was available this morning. Welcome to the Tenstrina. It is open, fronted, facing the street, which means the street is partly inside it, the noise, the light, the smell of the city moving through without asking. There are 2 stools, a low table with several things on it that you will look at in a moment. A bronze mirror hung on the back wall, slightly warped, showing a version of the room that is almost right. The man behind the stool is the tonsure. He is your barber. He is also your doctor. You sit down on the stool, and the tonsure moves behind you. He is a compact man, efficient in his movements, with the particular stillness of someone who has performed the same sequence of actions several thousand times. He picks up the iron shears, not the razor, not yet, the shears first, and begins working through your hair with the methodical patience of a man who is in no hurry, because hurry, in this profession, produces outcomes nobody wants. Outside, the street continues. A cart goes by. Someone is arguing about the price of something 2 stalls down. A dog crosses the doorway, decides against it, leaves. The tonsure sets down the shears. He picks up the novicula, the razor iron kept sharp on a whetstone that sits in a small clay bowl of water on the table. He tilts your head with one hand, not roughly, not gently either, just precisely, the way you position a thing you are about to work on. You watch him in the warped mirror. When the shave is finished, he will set the razor down and pick up something else. This is where the appointment takes its turn. The next instrument on the table is not a grooming tool. It is a small bronze cup, slightly wider at the lip than at the base, with a vent hole in the bottom that can be sealed with a fingertip. You have come in for a bloodletting. The tonsure did not specialize. In Rome, the distinction between grooming and medicine did not exist in the way it would later exist, and in the way it exists now, with separate buildings and separate training and separate people who are not allowed to do each other's jobs. The barber's shop was where you went for your beard and your bloodletting and your tooth extraction and your wound cauterization, sometimes in the same visit, always by the same hands. This was not considered alarming. It was considered convenient. The tonsure learned his trade by apprenticeship, watching, then assisting, then doing, under the supervision of someone who had also learned by watching and assisting and doing. There were no examinations. There were no licensing bodies. There was only the accumulated practice of a man who had performed these procedures enough times that most of his patients had survived them, which was the relevant credential. There is one item on the tonsure's table that had no cutting function, no medical function, no grooming function. It is the smallest thing on the table, and in some ways the most important. We will come back to it. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was how much of this happened in full view of the street. Cupping was performed at the barber's chair. The bronze cup was heated, held briefly over a flame until the air inside expanded, and then pressed against the skin of the patient's back or shoulder or neck, vent hole sealed. As the air inside cooled and contracted, the skin was drawn upward into the cup, producing a firm, reddish welt beneath the bronze. This was believed to draw bad humors toward the surface, where they could be released. Sometimes the skin was nicked first with the razor, so the blood itself was drawn into the cup. This was wet cupping. The alternative, without the nick, was dry cupping. The tonsure offered both. The patient's preference and the nature of the complaint determined which. Bloodletting by lance, it was also available. Small iron blades kept in a roll of leather on the table, each a slightly different size for different veins in different locations. The arm was the most common sight, the neck was possible. Records suggest the ankle was not uncommon. The tonsure knew the veins not from any formal anatomical education, but from the particular knowledge that comes from having opened a great many of them. Tooth extraction required a different tool entirely, the dentoscalpium, a thin iron pick for loosening, and for the extraction itself, a small forceps with ridged grips. There was no numbing agent in common use. There was poppy wine, offered beforehand in some establishments, a small cup, enough to take the edge off what was coming without preventing the patient from sitting still. The tonsure held your jaw with one hand. With the other he worked quickly. Speed was the mercy here. Wound treatment was the simplest part of the practice. Cleaning with vinegar, binding with linen. In infected wounds, the ones that arrived already angry and hot, cauterization with a heated iron was the option of last resort, used when the wound had progressed past the point where binding alone would answer. The tonsure moved between these procedures the way a cook moves between tasks. This patient, the shave. Next patient, the bloodletting, the one after the tooth. The stool was barely cold between them. And here is the part that is genuinely difficult to explain. The Roman patient was not troubled by this arrangement. There is no literature of complaint, no satirist mocking the absurdity of having your beard trimmed by the same hands that had just opened someone's vein. No petition to the city authorities asking that medicine be practiced somewhere with a door. What the Romans did write about, with some frequency, was bad barbers. Specifically, slow ones, ones who nicked you unnecessarily, ones who talked too much. Marshall has an entire epigram about a barber whose razor is so poorly maintained it constitutes an assault. The complaint was never about the arrangement. The arrangement was simply the world. The complaint was always about the execution. A woman on the Esquiline Hill sends her husband to the tonsure at the 3rd hour with instructions. The beard, and the thing on his arm that has been wrong for 2 weeks and is not getting better. The tonsure looks at the arm. He presses the skin around the wound with 2 fingers, which tells him something. He smells it briefly, which tells him something else. He selects the smaller lancet and opens the edge of the wound, not deeply, just enough, and presses a clean cloth against it and holds it there for a count of 30, which he performs in his head, while looking at something else, then vinegar, then a linen binding, wrapped 3 times and tucked under itself on the 4th pass. The husband asks if it will heal. The tonsure says it will probably heal. This is the most honest answer available to him, and he gives it without ceremony because false certainty, in this trade, has a way of returning to find you. When the husband leaves, the tonsure steps to the doorway of the shop. He reaches for the small object on the table, the one with no cutting edge, no medical function, no role in any grooming procedure. It is a bell, bronze small, with a wooden handle worn smooth from use. He rings it twice, clearly into the street. This was the signal. The chair is free. The procedure is finished. If you have been waiting, if you are the man with the tooth, or the woman with the cupping appointment, or simply someone who wanted a shave before the forum opened, the bell means come now. In some neighborhoods, the bell also meant something else. It meant someone had just bled, which was information the street had opinions about, and which sometimes drew a small cluster of observers to the doorway who had nothing better to do and found proceedings interesting. The bell was the smallest thing on the table. It rang across the whole street. Medicine wasn't private, it was public. It was the street, it was Tuesday. The tonsure shop stood on the street because in Rome almost everything that mattered stood on the street. Commerce, conversation, the morning's gossip, and the afternoon's argument, and the slow drift of the city's daily life across the stone. All of it visible, all of it audible, all of it available to anyone who walked past. Rome did not separate its functions into rooms with closed doors. It arranged them along the road, facing outward where they could be seen. It applied this same instinct to the dead, which is where we are going next, and which was, in its own way, a very public affair. Welcome to the 8th day. In Rome, death had a schedule. From the moment a person stopped breathing to the moment the earth closed over them, there were 8 days of prescribed activity, specific things that happened on specific days, performed by specific people in a specific order. Some of those people knew the deceased. Many of them did not. Several of them had never met him and would not have recognized him on the street the week before. This did not make their role any less essential. It made it a profession. The body is in the atrium. This is the front room of the house, the formal room, the one with the impluvium in the center, the shallow rectangular pool that catches rainwater through the open roof. The body has been washed and anointed and dressed and placed on a wooden bier, feet toward the door, which is the correct orientation, the one that has always been the correct orientation, and everyone in the room knows this without having been told. The candles are lit. There are flowers, because flowers slow certain processes, and also because they are what you bring. Outside the front door, which stands open, cypress branches have been placed against the frame. This is the signal to the street. It means a death has occurred here. Give the house a little room. The street does not entirely comply. It never does. Rome is a city of 1 million people, and it does not modify its pace for any individual departure from it. Carts still pass. Vendors still call. The ordinary noise of the Subura or the Aventine or the Transtiberum continues without interruption, right up to the open door, right up to the cypress branches, right up to the edge of wherever. Grief begins inside. The family sits with the body. Outside, on the street, a different kind of professional is already making arrangements. The Libitinari were Rome's death guild. They handled the body, the bier, the procession equipment, the torches, the grave goods, the logistics of burial or cremation, and the paperwork, because in Rome there was always paperwork, even for death, especially for death. They operated from an office near the Libitina Grove on the Esquiline Hill, where records of every death in the city were registered, and where you could rent everything a proper funeral required. Rent, not buy. The beer came back. The torches came back. The professional mourners, when their work was done, went home and were available for the following week. The Libitinari were considered ritually unclean. Contact with the dead transferred a pollution, not a moral one, not a permanent one, but a real one that required purification before you could re-enter ordinary civic life. The Libitinari lived with this pollution professionally. They managed it. They were, as a result, kept at a certain social distance by people who needed them urgently and thanked them quickly and did not invite them to dinner. This is a very old arrangement. Societies that need a thing and cannot look at the people who provide it tend to make the same bargain across centuries. There was one role at a Roman funeral performed exclusively by a person who had never met the deceased and was not expected to grieve. We will come back to who. The Roman funeral procession moved through the city at night. Night, in the early Republic and through much of the imperial period, was the preferred time, partly for practical reasons, partly because law and custom in various periods restricted date and processions that would block traffic, which tells you something about Rome's priorities and the relative urgency it assigned to commerce versus mourning. Torchbearers led the procession, then musicians, specifically horn players and a form of double flute, the tibia, whose sound was considered appropriate for the occasion, which is to say mournful in a way that was also somehow organized, rhythmic, controlled. Grief in Rome had a tempo. Behind the musicians came the praefici. The praefici were professional mourners, and they were exclusively women, and they were very good at their jobs. They had been hired by the family through the libetinarii, who knew where to find them, and they had been briefed on the deceased. His name, his offices if he held any, his significant relationships, his virtues as the family wished them remembered. Armed with this information, the praefici performed grief. They wailed, they beat their chests, they tore at their hair with a controlled violence that was practiced enough to be repeatable across multiple funerals in a week without causing injury. They improvised laments, called nini, that incorporated the details they had been given, weaving the dead man's name and achievements into a form of sung eulogy that was partly script and partly performance. The family behind them were not expected to perform. The praefici handled that. What the family was expected to do was process with dignity, which in Rome meant a particular quality of controlled, formal sorrow present, but not overwhelming, visible but not theatrical. The theatricality had been outsourced. This was not considered strange. It was considered appropriate. Grief was a public act with public requirements, and the requirements were exacting, and not every family could meet them without assistance. The praefici existed because grief, like the funeral beer and the torches and the grave goods, was something you could rent when you needed it to be done correctly. Best case scenario, the praefici were excellent, and the lament moved the crowd, and the deceased's reputation was burnished by his exit. Worst case, they showed up to the wrong house. This happened. Here is the part that should feel strange but somehow doesn't. The Romans knew the praefici were performing. Everyone in the procession knew. The women weeping loudest had been paid to weep, had received a briefing on the deceased, had done this same work for a different family 3 days prior. There was no pretense that this was spontaneous, and it did not diminish the occasion. If anything, it elevated it. The performance said, "This death is important enough to be done properly. This man warranted the full arrangement. Someone spent the money grief wasn't feeling. It was a statement about the value of the person who was gone." At the front of the procession, ahead of the torchbearers, ahead of the musicians, ahead even of the praefici, walked the ancestors. Not the ancestors themselves, their faces. The imagines were wax death masks, taken from the faces of notable Romans at the moment of death, and kept in wooden cabinets in the family's atrium, one mask per distinguished ancestor, labeled with a small placard naming the offices he had held. When a family member died, the masks came out. Actors, professionals, hired for the occasion, put them on. They wore the togas appropriate to the office recorded on the placard. They rode in open litters at the head of the procession, in order of seniority, the oldest ancestor at the front. The dead man, newly dead, processed behind his own ancestors, behind men who had died before his grandfather was born, behind faces made of wax worn by strangers, who had been paid to represent the compressed weight of an entire family's history. Consider for a moment what this looked like from the street. A Roman, watching from a doorway, would have seen, moving through the torchlight, a row of men in ancient togas wearing the faces of the famous dead, riding in silence. Then musicians, then weeping women, then the body, then the family, the whole history of a name, walking through the city one final time. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Not the wax masks, you could work up to the wax masks. The actors, the casting. The fact that somewhere in Rome there was a man whose professional skill was wearing the face of a dead senator, convincingly enough to satisfy the dead senator's descendants. That this man had a rate. That he was booked in advance for the better families, because the better families needed someone who could carry the consulship of 87 BC with appropriate gravity while riding on a litter through the subura at midnight. Death wasn't an ending, it was a production, and someone had to play the grandfather. The whole thing cost more than most Romans made in a year, which is why most Romans had made other arrangements. Rome organized its dead with the same bureaucratic precision it applied to everything else. The libitina, I kept the records. The prefecti kept the tempo, the actors kept the faces, the city kept moving. And the people who could not afford the full arrangement, the actors, the prefecti, the wax masks, the torchbearers had solved that problem too, with the same Roman instinct for logistics. Applied to the problem of dying without resources, they had formed clubs, monthly dues, a guaranteed funeral, someone to carry the bier who was not a stranger. Rome organized its dead, and next it organized what it used to clean them. Welcome to the fullonica. You will know it by the sound first, the rhythmic, wet slap of feet on stone, like someone walking very slowly through shallow water, except that it has been going on for 6 hours and shows no sign of stopping, then by the smell, which is its own argument, and which the neighborhood has long since absorbed into its general atmosphere without comment. Inside, the work is already underway. It has been underway since before the light came up. It will continue until the light goes down. The fullonica is built around its vats. Stone basins knee-deep, set in rows along the ground floor, each one connected to the next by a shallow channel that allows the liquid to be shifted from basin to basin as the process requires. The vats are not empty. They have not been empty since the fullonica opened, which was some years ago, and in a fullonica that is working correctly. The vats are never empty, because the moment one batch of cloth is finished, the next batch is already waiting in the corner, folded, tied in bundles, delivered by the households and the clothing merchants whose business depends on this place. A fuller's apprentice, young, barefoot, trousers rolled above the knee, steps into the nearest vat and begins. The motion is a kind of walking. Left foot, right foot, steady, rhythmic, the weight shifting with each step to press the cloth against the stone floor and against itself, working the liquid through the weave. It is not skilled work in the way the tonsur's work is skilled. It is relentless work, which is a different and in some ways harder thing. The apprentice will do this for several hours. His legs will ache in a specific way that becomes over time a familiar ache, the professional signature of his trade. The liquid he is standing in is not water. It was water once, in the sense that it passed through a living body and emerged changed, and was collected and brought here. The fullers cleaned Rome's clothing in human urine, not as a desperate measure, not as a last resort employed when nothing better was available, as the primary, preferred, chemically effective cleaning agent for wool and linen in a civilization that had access to alternatives, and chose this one because this one worked. Urine is alkaline. Fresh urine, left to age slightly, produces ammonia. Ammonia breaks down the oils and grease that accumulate in cloth, the lanolin in unwashed wool, the cooking oil on a kitchen tunic, the accumulated grime of a week in a Roman city. The fullers did not know the chemistry. They knew the result, which was that cloth soaked and worked in aged urine came out cleaner than cloth washed in water alone. This was knowledge transmitted by practice across generations of fullers. The way the tonsure transmitted his knowledge of veins. It worked. That was the argument. The argument was sufficient. The fullers had a professional rivalry with one specific other guild in Rome. A rivalry that was old and consistent, and once you understand the geography of the Roman city, makes immediate and slightly comic sense. We will come back to who, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the collection system. Because the urine had to come from somewhere, and Rome had solved that problem with characteristic directness. On street corners throughout Rome and outside public buildings, and beside the entrances to apartment blocks, there were large ceramic jars, waist-high, wide-mouthed, set into the ground or braced against the wall so they would not tip. Their purpose was not obscure. Everyone knew what they were for. You used them as you passed, if you needed to, and you did not think about it further, because there was nothing further to think. The jars were there. This was a service. At intervals throughout the day, collection workers employed by the fullonica, or by independent contractors who supplied several fullonici at once, made the rounds of the jars with a cart and transferred the contents into sealed vessels for transport. The logistics of this are exactly what you imagine them to be, and we will not dwell on them. The point is that the system worked. It was regular. It was reliable. The fulonici received their supply, and the streets received, in this one specific respect, a small measure of relief. Emperor Vespasian formalized the arrangement in the 1st century CE by taxing it. The vectigal urine, the urine tax, applied to the collection and commercial use of public urine, and generated revenue, and was considered by Vespasian to be a perfectly reasonable thing for an emperor to think about. When his son Titus objected to the indignity of the tax, Vespasian held up a coin, one of the coins the tax had produced, and said, according to the historian Suetonius, that it did not smell. Pecunia non olet, money does not smell. This became a proverb. It is still a proverb. Vespasian's contribution to the Latin language came directly from the urine tax, which is a thing that happened. After the urine came fuller's earth, a type of absorbent clay that was worked into the wet cloth to draw out remaining impurities and to help the fabric hold its shape as it dried. The cloth was then rinsed, stretched on wooden frames in the fullonica's courtyard, and left in the sun. The finished product was bright, clean, faintly stiff in the way that properly treated wool becomes faintly stiff. Perfectly normal on every back in Rome. Here is what most histories quietly leave out. The fullers were proud. There is a lararium, a household shrine, found in a fullonica in Pompeii that depicts the fuller's trade with the same dignity and careful detail that a soldier might record a campaign or a magistrate might commission a portrait. The fullers painted their work, the vats, the frames, the cloth being stretched in the courtyard. They put their tools on the wall beside their gods and treated both with equal seriousness. The fullonica at Pompeii on the Via dell'Abbondanza was one of the largest commercial operations in the city. The man who owned it was wealthy enough to seek political office and prominent enough that his electoral endorsement was painted on the exterior wall. The smell was not the point. The result was the point. A senator's toga requires a fuller. The toga was not a casual garment. It was 6 meters of undyed wool, draped in a specific way that required practice to execute and constant adjustment to maintain, and it was the formal garment of Roman civic life, worn to the forum, to the courts, to religious ceremonies, to dinner with people whose opinion mattered. A toga that was gray or stained or had lost its texture was not a minor problem. It was a visible statement about the man wearing it. So the senator sends the toga to the fullonica. His slave carries it in the morning and collects it, usually, by the following afternoon. The fuller examines it, notes the staining near the hem, which is oil, and the general dullness of the wool, which is the accumulated city. He assigns it to the primary vat. His apprentice steps in. 3 hours later, the toga is on the drying frame, stretched tight, its fibers opening in the afternoon heat. 2 stalls down from the fullonica's entrance, there is a perfume cellar. This is the rivalry. It was not dramatic. It was geographic and olfactory, and entirely logical once you see it. Both trades operated near the bathhouses, where the foot traffic was highest and the clientele most interested in smelling better than they currently did. The perfume seller offered the fast solution, a dab of something floral and expensive, applied at the door before you went inside. The fuller offered the slower solution, clothing, that had been genuinely cleaned and would not embarrass you in company. They needed the same customers. They occupied the same streets. And one of them smelled considerably worse than the other, which the perfume seller mentioned occasionally, and the fuller did not dignify with a response. The fuller had the senator's toga. The senator would be back next month, and the month after that, and every month until he died or fell from favor. The perfume seller had the walk-in trade. Money does not smell, but the laundry vats probably did, and the senator came back anyway. The fullonica cleaned what Rome wore. It returned the toga to the senator, the tunic to the merchant, the linen to the household that had sent it that morning. It kept the city's fabric in order, a service so embedded in daily life that it had its own tax, its own collection network, its own professional guild with its own shrine and its own civic ambitions. Rome organized its cleaning with the same instinct it organized everything else. And at the end of the day, when the cleaning was finished, the work was set aside. The vats were left to work overnight. Rome went to the baths. Welcome to the Thermae. You have been here before, in the sense that every Roman has been here before, in the sense that this is simply where you go, not for a specific purpose, not with a specific errand. You go the way you go to the street, because the day requires it, because the city is here, because there is nowhere else that contains quite this many things at once. The Thermae is not a bathhouse. It is everything else, with bathing also available. The entrance fee is 1 quadrans. This is the smallest coin in Roman currency. It is less than the cost of a piece of bread. Children under a certain age get in free, which has always struck certain observers as either generous or a comment on the expected revenue from children, and probably both. You hand over the coin and move inside. The changing room is already busy. Wooden shelves along the walls hold sandals, folded tunics, the small personal oil flasks that everyone brings and everyone keeps a hand near because theft in the apoditerium is common, and management's position on this has always been a kind of resigned acknowledgement that human nature is what it is, and the fee does not cover everything. You hand your clothes to a slave, yours, if you have one, or one of the Thermae's own attendants for a small additional coin, and move through into the first room. The tepidarium is warm, not hot, a transitional warmth engineered by the hypo coursed beneath the floor, the same underfloor heating system that kept certain foracaire comfortable in winter, here applied to an entire suite of rooms at significant expense. The floor tiles are warm under your bare feet. The air is humid. The noise of the changing room falls away behind you and is replaced by something lower, more diffuse. Conversation, water. Somewhere, someone is having what sounds like a business meeting. Someone is always having a business meeting. The Thermae is open. The city is inside it. The Roman bathhouse was open for most of the day. Depending on the city, the season, and the establishment, the Thermae received visitors from late morning until early evening. 6, 7, 8 hours of continuous operation, during which time you were welcome to arrive, stay as long as you wished, and conduct whatever business the premises could accommodate. The premises could accommodate quite a lot. There were food stalls in the outer corridors. Hot food, sausages, bread, small fried things on wooden skewers, sold by vendors who paid a fee to the Thermae's management for the right to be there. There were barbers working the changing rooms. There were physicians who consulted in the colonnaded gardens outside. There were booksellers. There were men whose business was information, which is to say they sat in the warm rooms and listened and occasionally passed notes, and this was understood and nobody asked them directly what they were doing there, and there were the other rooms, adjacent to the main bathing complex in the larger thermi, accessible through a door that was not hidden, but was not the main entrance either. There is one rule in the Roman bathhouse that every visitor understood, and that does not appear in any official regulation. We will come back to it, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the water. The thermi moved you through 3 rooms in sequence. The tepidarium first, the warm room transitional, where you acclimated and where most of the conversation happened. Then the caldarium, the hot room, steam rising from a large central basin, and from the heated floor and walls, the air thick enough to see through imperfectly, where you sweated out whatever the city had put into you over the previous day or 2. Then the frigidarium, the cold room, a plunge pool fed by unheated water, which was the conclusion, the shock, the thing that closed the pores and returned you to the world. In the caldarium, you used the strigil. The strigil was a curved iron or bronze blade with no cutting edge, shaped something like a very thin, elongated question mark, used to scrape the skin. The procedure was straightforward. Oil was applied first, either from your personal flask or purchased from an attendant, worked into the skin of the arms and shoulders and back. Then the strigil was drawn across the surface at a shallow angle, removing the oil along with the sweat and dirt that had accumulated beneath it. The scraping was the cleaning. There was no soap in common use. The strigil and oil were the Roman answer to the same problem soap would later solve, and they worked, in the sense that the skin was left clean and the pores were open, and the person emerging from the caldarium was genuinely cleaner than the person who had entered it. If you had a slave, the slave worked the strigil on the parts of your back you could not reach. If you did not have a slave, you could hire one of the thermi's attendants for this purpose, or ask the person next to you, which happened, and which in the thermi's social grammar was not. Strange request. The water in the main basins was changed once per day, at most, in the better establishments. Often less. By the afternoon session, the caldarium basin was the color of weak tea, and contained in solution a representative sample of everyone who had been in it since morning. People bathed in it anyway. The alternative was not bathing, and here is what the history books handle carefully and quickly. The thermi was, in certain periods and in certain establishments, mixed, men and women bathing in the same rooms. Not universally, not consistently, there were dedicated hours in some thermi, dedicated sections in others, dedicated facilities in the wealthiest complexes, but mixed bathing existed, was practiced, was complained about by moralists with a frequency that confirms it was not theoretical, and was at various points officially discouraged by emperors who had opinions about it, and officially ignored by cities that had decided the opinions were not their problem. Hadrian banned it. The ban did not hold everywhere. What the thermi contained was the city, and the city, in the afternoon, in the warm rooms, was not conducting itself with the formality the moralists preferred. A man we will call Gaius arrives at the thermi on the Aventine at the 6th hour, which is midday, which is the beginning of the busy session. He is a grain merchant of middling prosperity, not wealthy enough for a private bath at home, not poor enough to use the smallest neighborhood thermi where the water is changed less and the stalls have fewer options. This one is right. He comes 3 times a week. The attendant at the door knows his face and does not require the coin to be shown before it is offered. He moves through the tepidarium and stops. There is a man he recognizes, a shipping agent from Ostia, whose business he has been trying to reach for 2 months. The shipping agent is in conversation with someone else, sitting on the low stone bench near the warm pool, gesturing with the particular patience of a man explaining something he has explained before. Gaius sits nearby. He does not interrupt. He waits with the specific patience of a man who has learned that the thermi rewards waiting, that everyone comes through eventually, that the warm room is where the city's business actually gets. Done because it is the one place in Rome where you cannot pretend you are not there. 20 minutes later, the shipping agent's conversation ends. He looks up, he sees Gaius. The meeting that could not be arranged for 2 months happens, informally, in the tepidarium, in the space of a quarter of an hour, and is concluded before either man moves to the caldarium. Later, in the changing room, the shipping agent reaches past Gaius for his sandals without looking at him. Gaius does not acknowledge this either, because in the changing room, status reasserts itself. The shipping agent is the client of a man whose social rank is above Gaius's, and in the changing room that matters again, and both men understand this, and neither has to say so. This was the rule that appeared in no official regulation. In the warm rooms, rank relaxed. In the changing room, it returned. The threshold between the two was unmarked and universally understood. Status wasn't gone. It was just resting. The Thermae was the city in miniature. Every class, every trade, every ambition present, circulating, warming itself in the same rooms, using the same water, observing the same unwritten rules about where rank applied and where it did. Not the grain merchant and the senator and the shipping agent and the physician and the men whose business was information, all of them together in the steam. Rome built this, but while Rome was arranging its public baths and its urine taxes and its communal grief, something far quieter was already taking shape in the hills of Italy. And then in the mountains of France, and then everywhere. We are going somewhere colder now, and considerably more sober. Long before the monastery became a symbol of silence, it was something far more practical, and considerably stranger. In the 6th century, a man named Benedict of Nursia sat down and wrote a document, 73 chapters, precise, calm, occasionally alarming in the way that very calm documents sometimes are when you read them slowly enough to understand what they are actually saying. The document told a community of men exactly what to do at every hour of the day and night. Every hour. Including the hours most people consider firmly off the schedule. The monastery sits on a hill. It is always on a hill or near water, or both, positioned with the practical instinct of men who understood that self-sufficiency required certain things from the land, and that the land had opinions about where it would and would not cooperate. The walls are thick, the rooms are small, the windows where they exist are narrow not for beauty, not for drama, but because narrow windows lose less heat, and the hills of central Italy in January are considerably less hospitable than the paintings suggest. Inside, at this hour, it is quiet. Not silent. Silence is a specific discipline, governed by specific rules, and even within the silence there is the sound of the building itself. Wind against stone, the small creak of a wooden door in its frame, water moving through the channel that runs along the kitchen wall. Fire where fire is permitted, which is not everywhere and not always. 40 men sleep in a common dormitory. They have been asleep since Compline, the last prayer of the night, sung in the chapel at the close of the day, and they will sleep until the bell. The bell rings at approximately 2 in the morning. This is not an emergency. This is matins. This is how every night ends, and has ended since the community was founded, and will end until it is not. You get up. This is the schedule. The rule of Saint Benedict governed every waking hour, and several of the sleeping ones. Benedict divided the day into a sequence of prayer, work, and reading, cycling continuously from before dawn until after dark, with the prayer hours, the divine office, anchoring everything else. In place, there were 7 of them, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. If you are counting, that is 8. Benedict counted differently. The point is that they were frequent, they were non-negotiable, and they arrived on a schedule that adjusted by season. Longer nights meant longer prayer in winter, longer work in summer, with the precision of a man who had thought very carefully about how much of a human life could be structured before it stopped being a life and became a machine? His answer was more than you would think. Benedict wrote one provision into the daily schedule that modern readers almost always interpret as a kindness. A rest, a small mercy built into an otherwise relentless document. We will come back to what it actually was. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the chapter of faults, which happened every morning. In front of everyone, the chapter of faults was a daily assembly. After prime, the first prayer of the morning, said at dawn, the community gathered in the chapter house, a rectangular room, stone, with stone benches along the walls, and the abbot's chair at the head. The rule was read aloud. A passage every morning, rotating through the 73 chapters over the course of the year, so that every monk heard the whole document read to him annually and could not later claim ignorance of what it contained. Then the floor was opened. Any monk could rise and accuse himself of a fault committed since the previous chapter. A small failure of the rule, arriving late to prayer, losing patience during work, breaking the silence in a corridor where silence was required. The monk stood, named the fault plainly, and received a penance from the abbot. Additional prayers, a reduced portion at meals, a period of exclusion from certain communal activities. Then any monk could accuse another. This is the part that requires a moment. The accusation was not anonymous. You stood and named the brother and named the fault. The named brother could not object during the chapter. The rule was specific on this point, with the particular specificity that suggests Benedict had anticipated the objection and decided against it. Allowing it, the brother received the abbot's judgment. The chapter moved on. The system was not designed for cruelty. It was designed for accountability in a community where privacy was minimal. Proximity was total, and small frictions left unaddressed had a way of becoming large ones over the course of years. 40 men in a small building, working together, praying together, eating together, sleeping in the same room without a formal mechanism for clearing the air. The air did not clear. It was maintenance, regular, systematic, slightly uncomfortable maintenance of the social fabric of a community that had nowhere else to go. The monks who lasted, the ones who remained for decades, who became the senior brothers the younger monks watched for instruction, had learned to deliver an accusation with the same flat tone they used for everything else. It was Tuesday. Someone had been late to Lauds. The chapter noted it. And here is the part that most readings of the rule quietly miss. Benedict was not a harsh man. Read the rule slowly, and what emerges is someone deeply aware that he was writing for human beings, specific, fallible, tired human beings who had chosen a difficult life and would struggle with it in predictable ways. He wrote provisions for the sick. He wrote provisions for the young, who were not to be held to the same standard as the professed brothers. He wrote provisions for guests, who were to be received as Christ, which meant with warmth, which meant the kitchen had to have something ready. He anticipated failure. He built the corrections in. The harshness was not cruelty. It was architecture. A novice, new to the community, perhaps 19, arrived from a farm outside Spoleto 3 months ago, is seated in the Scriptorium during the hour after none. He has a psalter open in front of him. He is supposed to be reading. He is not reading. He is looking at the wall. Not at anything on the wall. There is nothing on the wall. Nothing decorative. Nothing to look at. He is simply looking at it, which is what a mind does when it has been awake since 2 a.m, and has prayed 7 times and worked 4 hours in the kitchen garden, and is now expected to read for another hour before Vespers. Behind him, the armarius, the senior monk responsible for the Scriptorium, moves along the row. He does not speak. Speech in the Scriptorium requires permission and purpose, and this does not qualify as either. He pauses behind the novice. He looks at the open psalter. He looks at the novice's eyes, which are directed at the wall. He moves on. At the next chapter of faults, the novice will stand and accuse himself, because the armarius's pause was noted, and the novice knows it was noted, and in the chapter house there is no advantage waiting for someone else to name you first. He will say, I failed to read during the appointed hour. He will receive the penance, he will return to his seat. The reading hour was not rest, it was supervised. Benedict had written it into the schedule with the same care he had written in matins and the chapter of faults and the reception of guests, not as a break in the structure, but as a continuation of it. The monk read because reading was a form of prayer, and prayer was the work. And the work did not pause between the bells. It changed its shape. The novice had looked at the wall. The wall had not been on the schedule. Discipline wasn't punishment. It was the shape of the day. The rule prescribed everything the monk did, when he woke, when he prayed, when he worked, when he read and how attentively, when he spoke, which was rarely, when he ate, which brings us to a different kind of power entirely. Because Benedict's document, for all its 73 chapters and its careful architecture of hours, left one domain to someone else, it left the food to the cellarer, and the cellarer, in a monastery of 40 silent and hungry men who had been awake since 2 in the morning, was quietly the most powerful person in the building. Welcome to the Cellarium. It is the coldest room in the monastery, which is intentional. Cold preserves. Cold is the point. Along the walls, on stone shelves and wooden racks and iron hooks driven into the mortar, are the things the community will eat and drink for the next several weeks. If the cellarer has done his job correctly, which he usually has, because the cellarer is not a man who makes the same mistake twice. He is also not a man you want to have made an enemy of. Not here. The cellarium is at the end of a corridor off the kitchen, through a door that is locked. The cellarer has the key. He has the only key. This is not a security arrangement, or rather, it is not only a security arrangement. It is a statement about the structure of authority inside these walls, which runs from the abbot downward through a sequence of appointed offices. And the cellarer's office sits higher in that sequence than it might appear from the outside. From the outside, the cellarer manages food. This is accurate. The way saying a river manages water is accurate. Technically correct. Missing the weight of the thing, the shelves hold grain, counted by the measure. Oil, in sealed ceramic vessels, stacked too deep. Salt, in a locked box within the locked room, because salt is expensive and small amounts disappear in ways that are difficult to trace. Dried fish, dried legumes in cloth sacks, each one tied and labeled in the cellarer's handwriting. Root vegetables, laid in rows on clean straw. Cheese, aging on a high shelf where the air is driest. And in the alcove at the back, behind a second door that requires a second key, one the cellarer keeps separately, on a cord around his neck, even when he sleeps, the ale. 40 monks, 1 gallon each per day per the allowance. The cellarer knows exactly how many gallons are left. He always knows. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed the cellarer's character with unusual care, not his duties. His character, Benedict wrote that the cellarer should be wise, mature in conduct, temperate, not a great eater, not arrogant, not excitable, not offensive, not slow, not wasteful. He should be like a father to the whole community. He should serve the brothers' needs with the quiet competence of a man who understood that his job was not to hold the stores, but to distribute them, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between service and control. Benedict wrote this because he had clearly observed what happened when a cellarer forgot the distinction. The cellarer, who remembered his role, was the quiet engine of the community. The cellarer who forgot it was something else entirely. Asterisk asterisk loop a planted asterisk asterisk. There is one food item the rule explicitly prohibited that the monks of multiple Benedictine abbeys found a solution for. a solution so straightforward and so perfectly constructed that it is difficult to decide whether to admire it or simply accept it as evidence that hunger is more inventive than theology. We will come back to it, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what the rule permitted, because what it permitted was more than most people assume. The daily food allowance under the rule was specific. 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, different from each other, so that a brother who could not eat one had the other available. A 3rd dish of fruit or fresh vegetables if the season provided them, which the season did not always do in central Italy in February. A pound of bread per day, the same pound divided between the main meal and supper, with a slightly larger portion on days when the work had been heavier, at the cellarer's discretion. The cellarer's discretion appeared often in the rule. It was, on reflection, the most frequently recurring phrase in the sections governing food. Meat was restricted. The rule prohibited the flesh of 4-footed animals for all but the sick. The infirmary had its own provisions, and the sick were permitted what they needed, which Benedict specified without apology, because a man who is ill enough to be in the infirmary is not a man the rule should be arguing with. For the healthy brothers, the prohibition held. Fish was permitted. Fowl occupied a complicated middle ground that abbeys interpreted differently and argued about with the particular intensity reserved for questions where the stakes are simultaneously theological and gastronomic. The ale allowance was 1 hemina per day, roughly half a pint by modern measure, though scholars dispute the exact conversion with an energy that suggests they feel it matters, which perhaps it does. Benedict added, with the weariness of a man who had been on a hill in Italy for a long time, that he knew the monks of his own time needed more. He permitted a full pint. He noted that in places where the work was harder or the heat was greater, the superior could increase the allowance. He asked only that no one drink to excess. The word excess was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. In practice in the abbeys of France and Germany and Britain, where the climate was colder and the work was harder, and the water supply was frequently unreliable in ways that made ale the more prudent option, the allowance crept. A hemina became a pint became a quart. Records from certain English abbeys suggest a gallon per monk per day was not unusual by the high medieval period. Benedict had asked only that no one drink to excess. He had not defined excess. And here is the part that most histories present as an amusing footnote and then move past. The cellarer had favorites, not officially. Not according to the rule, which was explicit that the cellarer should serve each brother without regard to his standing, that no preference should be shown, that the stores were the community's and not the cellarer's to distribute with a personal agenda. And yet, 40 men in a small building, eating the same food, praying the same prayers for decades. The cellarer knew who had covered for him during a difficult chapter of faults 3 years ago. He knew who had not. The portion was always the prescribed portion. The quality of the cut, the freshness of the loaf, the speed with which a request was answered, these things varied. A senior monk, 15 years in the community, currently serving as the cantor, responsible for leading the choir through the divine office 8 times per day, arrives at the Cellarium door on a Friday morning. Friday is a fast day. On fast days, the main meal moves to mid-afternoon, the supper is eliminated, and the food available is simpler bread, dried fish, whatever the garden has produced this week, which at this point in late autumn is not encouraging. The cantor has a request. He has been fighting a cough for a week, not severe enough for the infirmary, but persistent enough that the cold air in the chapel during matins has become its own small punishment. He would like something warm, a cup of warmed ale, perhaps, or a small portion of whatever the kitchen is preparing for the sick brothers. The cellarer looks at him for a moment, then he opens the door. On the table inside, next to a wrapped portion of bread and the dried fish for the afternoon meal, there is something else. something the cantor does not immediately identify because it does not belong in a fast-day kitchen in an Italian monastery in October. It is a tail, broad, flat, scaled, unmistakably from an animal that spent its life building dams in cold rivers. Beaver, the beaver in medieval theological classification, lived primarily in water. It was semi-aquatic. Its tail, which it used as a rudder, was upon reflection, upon considerable and apparently sincere reflection, fish. Not fish, adjacent. Not fish, like fish, canonically officially by formal ecclesiastical determination. Fish. On fast days, fish was permitted. The Cellarer had beaver tail. He had not acquired it by accident. This was not a loophole. This was a solution arrived at through the same patient, practical, slightly lateral thinking that had kept monasteries functional for 6 centuries. The rule was absolute. The interpretation was the work. The cantor received the warm ale and the fish, both of them, because the Cellarer made his determinations quietly and without a great deal of commentary, and returned to the chapel in time. Sext faith wasn't rigid, it was creative. The Cellarer fed the community. He managed the grain and the oil and the salt and the ale and the occasional theological fish. He held the key on a cord around his neck, and he knew at any given moment exactly how many days the stores would last, and which brother had requested something extra, and whether the request had been reasonable. He was, in his way, the memory of the community. But the monastery had another memory, a more deliberate one. It was kept in a different room, in silence, in cold that the Cellarer's key did not open. We are going to the Scriptorium. Welcome to the quietest room in the building. This is not a compliment. The Scriptorium is quiet the way a held breath is quiet, not peaceful, not restful, but suspended. 40 men have been awake since 2 in the morning. They have prayed 8 times. They have worked in the kitchen garden and the bakehouse and the cellarium, and wherever else the morning required them. Now they are seated at wooden desks in a room with no fire, and they are copying. They will do this for 3 hours. The desks run in 2 rows facing the windows. The windows face south, which is intentional. South light is the most consistent through the day, the least likely to shift and shadow and require the scribe to stop and reposition himself and lose the line he was holding in his head. The windows are unglazed in many abbeys, covered in the colder months with oiled cloth or thin scraped horn that lets the light through while keeping most of the wind out. Most of the wind, the room is cold. Not the dramatic cold of a winter storm or an open hillside, but the specific, patient cold of an enclosed stone room in which no fire is permitted because fire and vellum and centuries of irreplaceable manuscript are a combination that every armarius has thought about carefully and arrived at the same answer. The cold settles in the joints first, then the fingers. The 3-fingered grip, thumb, index, middle finger, the quill held at a shallow angle across the base of the index finger, becomes, over the course of a long copying session, something the hand maintains through stubbornness rather than comfort. The scribe ahead of you has been here since the hour after terce. His neck is at an angle that looks temporary, but has become, over 15 years at this desk, permanent. He dips the quill. He writes. He dips again. The scratch of it is the only sound in the room, and after a while you stop hearing it, the way you stop hearing water. The Scriptorium produced the written memory of the medieval world. Scripture, theology, history, medicine, mathematics, law, philosophy, the texts that survived the collapse of Rome and the centuries of disruption that followed, survived largely because men in cold rooms copied them by hand, 1 letter at a time, for decades, in obedience to a schedule that assigned them here the way it assigned them to the kitchen garden and the bakehouse and the choir. They did not always find it meaningful. The evidence for this is in the margins. Medieval manuscript margins are one of the most honest records of human experience that history has produced. A narrow strip of vellum at the edge of scripture or theology or legal commentary, where the scribe, constrained to silence in every other register, was occasionally permitted to write something of his own. The marginal note, the colophon at the end of a finished book. Small, personal, unguarded, they are often complaints. One scribe left a note in the margin of his manuscript that historians have returned to repeatedly, not because it is dramatic, not because it reveals anything about theology or politics or life of the abbey, but because it is the most human thing written in a monastery that has otherwise survived only in its formal voice. We will come back to it, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what copying was believed to earn. The tools of the Scriptorium were specific and expensive and treated accordingly. Vellum, the writing surface, was prepared from animal skin, most commonly calf, stretched on a frame while wet and scraped thin with a curved blade called a lanellum until it was pale and even and nearly translucent at the edges. A single Bible required the skins of approximately 250 calves. This number was known to the monks who copied Bibles. It informed, in some quiet way, how they felt about errors. Errors were managed with a small knife. The scalpellum, kept at the desk for the purpose of scraping away mistakes before the ink dried fully into the vellum. A scribe who caught his error quickly could correct it without visible damage. A scribe who did not catch it, or who pressed too hard with the knife, left a thin place in the vellum, a soft spot that the next generation of readers would find with their fingertips and understand immediately. The quill was cut fresh each day. The right wing feather of a goose, preferably, because the natural curve of the right wing feather fell away from the writing hand and did not obstruct the scribe's sightline. The nib was cut with the scalpellum to the armarius's preference. Different widths produced different letter forms, and different texts required different widths, and the armarius had opinions about this that he communicated through demonstration rather than instruction, because the Scriptorium did not permit instruction aloud. Ink was iron gall, tannin from oak galls dissolved with iron sulfate in water or wine, thickened slightly, with a small amount of gum arabic to help it adhere. It dried dark. Over centuries it dried darker, then began to eat through the vellum from the acid in the iron, which is why some manuscripts, examined closely, show the ghost of writing visible from the back of the page and, in the worst cases, small holes where the ink has consumed itself through the support entirely. The words survived. The surface they were written on did not always. A scribe of the 9th Legion, no. A scribe of the 9th hour, seated at his desk after sext, dipped his quill and continued. And here is the part that changes how you read the complaints. Copying Scripture was not merely labor. It was, in the theological understanding of the period, spiritually efficacious. Each letter was a blow against the devil. Each completed page was a prayer in a form that would outlast the man who wrote it. The Venerable Bede recorded the belief that a scribe who copied holy texts would be judged at the last day not only on his conduct, but on the letters themselves, that the ink on his fingers was kind of evidence presented on his behalf. The scribe was cold, and his neck hurt, and his fingers had stopped cooperating an hour ago. He was also, theoretically, accumulating merit with every line. Whether this helped is between him and the record. The armarius moved through the room after sext. He walked the row without sound. The soft sole of his sandal on the stone floor was the only announcement of his presence, and he looked at each desk as he passed. Not at the monk, at the work. The line quality, the spacing between words, the angle of the letters against the ruled lines that had been drawn across the vellum, with a dry stylus before writing began. He stopped occasionally. He did not speak. He leaned forward, examined a section, straightened, moved on. The monks did not look up. Looking up was not, technically, a violation of the rule. But it was the kind of thing that accumulated a pattern of inattention, a record of distraction that the armarius kept in his head, and that surfaced, eventually, in the chapter of faults or in quiet reassignment of a scribe from the Psalters to the less demanding work of copying agricultural accounts. Nobody wanted to copy agricultural accounts. At the end of a manuscript, in the colophon, the scribe's note that closed the book, monks occasionally wrote something beyond the date and the title. Sometimes a prayer, sometimes a dedication, sometimes something else. One scribe, in a manuscript whose abbey of origin is uncertain, and whose precise date is disputed somewhere in the range of the 8th and 9th centuries, wrote this, new parchment. Bad ink, the evening is coming, and then, beneath it, after a small gap that suggests he put the quill down and picked it up again, I am hungry. That is the whole note. 4 sentences, 2 of them not quite sentences. The manuscript survived. It is held now in a European archive where scholars have examined it for what it reveals about the text it contains, and about the hand that produced it, and about the abbey's scribble traditions. The monk's name was not recorded. It never was. The work was the point, not the worker. And somewhere between those two ideas, a cold and hungry man had put down his quill and written the only true thing left to say. The Scriptorium was the monastery's external voice. Everything it produced was directed outward to the abbeys that would request copies, to the scholars who would read them, to the centuries that would inherit them. The monk at the desk was a conduit. His name was not the point. His hunger was not the point. The letter was the point, and the letter would last, and the letter was enough. But inside the walls, the monastery had its own internal voice, and that voice had very specific things to say about what happened when a monk forgot the schedule. That is where we are going next. Your job this morning is to be late. Not intentionally. You did not plan it. You were at your desk in the Scriptorium when the bell for lauds sounded, and the distance between the Scriptorium and the chapel is not great. But there was a moment, a pause, a hesitation, quill still in your hand, and by the time you arrived, the brothers were already on the 2nd verse. You are not the first monk to have been late to lauds. The rule has a procedure for this. It has a procedure for everything. The chapel at lauds is pale with early light. The windows on the east wall catch the first gray of the morning and distribute it across the stone floor in long, thin rectangles that shift slightly as the earth moves and the light changes, and the brother's breath rises in small clouds in the cold air above the choir stalls. This is the 4th prayer of the night. The 5th, if you count matins separately from nocturnes, which Benedict did, and which you have stopped doing because the distinction stopped mattering somewhere around the 3rd week. The choir stalls run in 2 facing rows, the senior brothers on one side, the novices and junior monks on the other. Each stall has a small wooden seat that folds up when not in use, and when the community stands for the Gloria, the seats fold up together in a sound like a single muted clap, which you have heard so many times it has entered the category of sounds that exist below consciousness. You enter through the south door. Several heads turn, not many, not dramatically. 2 or 3 brothers whose position near the door gives them a sightline to the entrance, and who register your arrival with the particular stillness of men who have noted something without deciding yet what to do about it. You find your stall. You fold down the seat. The Gloria continues. The noting has already happened. The rule of St. Benedict described 4 degrees of punishment, not vaguely, not as general principles, with the specific, graduated precision of a man who had decided that ambiguity in this area was more dangerous than clarity, and who had accordingly produced a document that told a community exactly what would happen, in what order, for what offenses, with what opportunities for correction at each stage. The system was not designed to be harsh. It was designed to be legible. A monk who knew the 4 degrees knew at any moment where he stood. He knew what a first offense would cost him, what a second would cost him, and what the fourth degree meant in practice, which was something he would be given time to consider before it happened. The offenses that triggered the system were not always large. Arriving late to the divine office, speaking in a place designated for silence, laughing at the wrong moment. The rule mentioned laughter specifically, with a care that suggests Benedict had encountered the wrong kind of laughter and had thoughts about it. Handling monastery property carelessly, making excuses when corrected. Benedict described one punishment in this sequence as a mercy. Not a consequence, not a correction, a mercy. We will come back to what it was. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the monk who ran away. The first degree was private. The abbot spoke to the monk alone once, then a second time if the first produced no change. This was not a small thing. A private conversation with the abbot was not an administrative meeting. The abbot held, in Benedict's conception, the place of Christ within the community, and a private correction from him carried a weight that a modern reader would need to hold carefully to understand. It was not shouting. It was not humiliation. It was worse than both, in the specific way that quiet disappointment from someone whose opinion structures your world is worse than anger. Most monks did not reach the second degree. The second degree moved the offending monk to the edge of the community's shared life. He ate alone, after the others had finished, in a separate space, without the prayers that framed the meal. He was excluded from the communal reading during meals, which meant he ate in silence without even the text for company. He completed his work assignments, attended the divine office, slept in the dormitory. He was present in the body and absent in every other sense. The third degree extended the exclusion to prayer itself. The monk was excommunicated not from the church, but from the community's liturgical life. He did not enter the choir. He did not receive communion. He worked and ate and slept among men who were praying 8 times a day, and he performed none of it with them. The divine office continued around him like a river around a stone. The fourth degree was corporeal punishment. Benedict specified it for the young, and for those who did not respond to the earlier degrees administered by the senior brothers, not in anger, not publicly beyond what the community's presence required, and preceded always by the abbot's determination that the earlier degrees had been tried and had failed. Between the third and fourth degrees, Benedict inserted a provision that appears in no other monastic rule of the period. He instructed the senior brothers to visit the excommunicated monk privately, to speak with him, to console him, to tell him that the penance was temporary and the community was waiting. He called this the sponge of encouragement. That phrase is in the rule. Benedict wrote it himself. Here is the part that most readings of the punishment system quietly step over. The monk could leave. He was not a prisoner. The monastery had walls, but the walls had a gate, and the gate had the road, and the road had the world. A monk who found the third degree intolerable, or the fourth approaching, could walk out. Several did. The records of various abbeys note their departure with a brevity that does not quite conceal the community's particular combination of sorrow and relief. What the rules specified was what happened if he came back, because some of them came back, and Benedict had a procedure for that too. 3 chances, 3 returns. On the 4th departure, the door did not reopen. A monk 7 years in the community, assigned to the bakehouse, no particular distinction in the choir, arrived late to Lauds on a Wednesday in what the records of the period would have noted only as a cold month. He had been late before. The chapter of faults had noted it twice. The abbot had spoken to him privately once, with the quiet that carried weight. On this Wednesday, the second degree began. He moved his bowl to the end of the table. He ate after the others. He ate without the reading, without the prayers that opened and closed the meal, in the specific silence of a man who is present in a room that has reorganized itself around his absence. The brothers did not avoid him. They did not acknowledge him. They passed the bread in his direction when the loaf reached the end of the table, because the second degree did not include starvation, only separation. He sat with this for 4 days. On the 5th day he went to the abbot, and here is what Benedict called the mercy. The second degree, eating alone after the others, without the prayers, was the punishment Benedict described as preferable to harsher correction because it preserved the monk's dignity while making the cost of the offense visible, not to the community who already knew, to the monk himself. Eating outside the communal meal was not, in a monastery, a minor inconvenience. The meal was not primarily about food. The meal was one of the few hours in the day when the community existed as a single body, reading, listening, eating together, bound by the same text and the same bread and the same walls. To eat outside, it was to experience the community's shape from the outside, to feel for 4 days what the alternative to belonging looked like. Benedict called it a mercy because it was recoverable, the door back was open, the community was waiting on the other side of it. Punishment wasn't exile, it was a mirror. You looked at it long enough to understand what you were being shown. Then you went back to the table. The punishment system returned the monk to the community. That was its purpose and its measure, not the suffering it produced, but the return it enabled. A monk who completed the second degree and went to the abbot and came back to the table had not been broken. He had been reoriented. The community absorbed him again with the particular lack of ceremony that characterizes institutions that have absorbed many such returns, and understand that ceremony makes re-entry harder, not easier. The monastery kept its living close. It kept its dead even closer, and the arrangements it made for them were more precise than you would expect. Welcome to the infirmarium. It is warmer than the rest of the monastery. This is the one concession the rule makes without conditions. The sick receive heat, and food beyond the standard allowance, an exemption from the prayer hours when the hours would harm them. Benedict wrote these provisions with a directness that suggests they were not negotiable, and he did not intend them to be. The man in the bed against the far wall has been here for 11 days. This morning, the infirmarian sent for the abbot. The community knows. Not because anyone has announced it. Announcements in a monastery travel slowly, through the particular channels of a community that does not speak freely, and has therefore developed a fluency in other signals. A glance held a moment longer than necessary, a change in the infirmarian's pace as he crosses the cloister. The abbot moving toward the infirmarium at an hour when the abbot does not usually move toward the infirmarium. By the time the bell rings summoning the community, most of the brothers already understand why. They come from wherever the schedule had placed them, the Scriptorium, the Cellarium, the kitchen garden, the choir. They wash their hands because the rule is specific about this, even now, even here. They enter the infirmarium in order of seniority, which is how the community always moves when it moves as a body, and they arrange themselves around the room, and the man in the bed looks at them, or does not look at them, depending on how far the dying has progressed. The abbot administers the last rites. The brothers begin to pray. They will not stop until it is finished, not in shifts, not in rotation with rest periods. Continuously, one voice taking up where another pauses, the divine office suspended in favor of this older and more particular obligation, the community holding its dying member in an unbroken net of sound until the sound is no longer needed. This is the first thing the monastery does for its dead. It is still the living man. The monastery had a procedure for dying, not for death, for dying. The approach, the preparation, the managed passage from one state to the other. It was not left to chance or instinct or the particular customs of the dying man's family. It was governed, as everything in the monastery was governed, by the accumulated practice of a community that had watched many of its members die and had developed, over generations, a set of arrangements it believed made the thing go better. The dying monk was moved from his bed to the floor, specifically to a mat of hair cloth placed directly on the stone, which was the material of penance and humility, and to which the seriously ill were transferred when death was considered close, so that the last surface they touched was the hard and unadorned ground, rather than the relative comfort of the infirmary mattress. This was not cruelty. It was theology made physical. The body returned to the earth before the earth received it. The posture of a man who had spent his life professing poverty, enacting that profession in the final available moment. In some Benedictine abbeys, one specific item belonging to the dying monk was identified and set aside before he had finished dying, given to a particular person before the body was cold. We will come back to which item, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what happened to the shoes. The washing of the body was communal. In the world outside the monastery walls, this work belonged to the undertaker, to the libetinarii, or their medieval equivalents, professionals, set apart by their contact with death, compensated, and then kept at a certain distance by the people who had needed them. Inside the monastery there was no such distance. The brothers, who had worked alongside the dead man, prayed alongside him. Eaten at the same table and slept in the same dormitory, they washed him. This was not delegated. It was considered an act of charity, the final service one member of the community could perform for another, and it was performed with the same flat, practical attention that characterized everything the community did. The body was washed, anointed, dressed in the habit. The hands were arranged. The face was composed. Then the trentals began. 30 masses, said for the soul of the dead brother, over the 30 days following his death. Not all at once, distributed across the month, integrated into the community's existing liturgical schedule, each one a specific and formal petition on behalf of a man who was now, by the theology of the period, in a state of transition that prayers could influence. The community continued its life and simultaneously held a liturgical conversation with the afterlife on behalf of one of its members. This went on for a month. At the end of the month, the dead monk's name entered the community's necrology, the Book of the Dead, read aloud on the anniversary of each brother's death, every year, indefinitely. A monk who had been in the community for 40 years and had died in unremarkable circumstances and had left no manuscripts and held no important offices would nonetheless be named, every year on his death date in the chapter house for as long as the community survived. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Not the washing, you could work up to the washing, the necrology. The fact that somewhere in Europe there is a monastery that has been reading the same names aloud every year for 900 years, and that among those names are men whose only recorded act was living quietly in a cold building for several decades and then dying in it. The name was the thing. It lasted longer than the man. And here is what the outside world almost always misses about monastic death. It was not solemn, or rather, it was solemn in the way that competence is solemn. The brothers who washed the body had washed bodies before. The infirmarian who prepared the hair-cloth mat had prepared it before. The abbot who administered the last rites had administered them before, and would administer them again, and had developed over years of practice the particular quality of presence that the dying require, not dramatic, not performative, just steady and there. The monastery had done this many times. It knew what it was doing. Death wasn't an interruption. It was part of the schedule. The body is in the chapel now, on the bier before the altar, and the community has returned to its schedule. Or rather, the schedule has absorbed the death and continued, the way the rule absorbed everything by assigning it a place and a procedure and moving forward. In the Cellarium, the cellarer is already at work. He has a list. The dead monk's shoes are the first item. Not his habit. The habit goes with the body, is buried with it. because the habit is the man's identity within the community, and cannot be meaningfully separated from him even in death. Not his tools if he had them, the scribe's knife, the gardener's blade, which return to the common store and are redistributed at the armarius's discretion over the following weeks. The shoes go immediately, today, before the trentals begin, before the necrology is updated, before the grave is finished in the cloister garden. The cellarer walks the dormitory. He looks at the brothers' feet. He is looking for the worst pair, the most worn, the thinnest at the sole, the ones that have been repaired past the point where repair is the honest word for what has been done to them. He finds them. He notes the brother's name. He returns to the cellarium and selects from the dead man's shoes, which were newer, which were better, which will serve. The exchange happens without ceremony. The cellarer presents the shoes, the brother accepts them. Neither speaks beyond what is necessary, because neither needs to. The community owned nothing individually. Everything belonged to the house. The dead monk's shoes had always belonged to the house. The cellarer was simply returning them to use. But the timing, the speed of it, the priority of it, the fact that the shoes moved before almost anything else, was not bureaucratic indifference. It was the monastery's specific form of tenderness. The brother with the worn soles would be on his feet in the chapel within hours, at vespers, standing on cold stone. The shoes were needed now. Poverty wasn't an ideal. It was an inventory problem, and the cellarer solved inventory problems before the grave was cold. The monastery buried its dead in the cloister garden. Not in a distant churchyard, not in a cemetery outside the walls, in the garden at the center of the building, the one the brothers walked past every day on their way from the dormitory to the chapel, and from the chapel to the refectory, and from the refectory back to work. The dead remained among the living. Their names were read every year. Their shoes were on someone else's feet before the earth settled. The monastery kept everything close. It wasted nothing, and out of that arrangement, that silence, that poverty, that relentless conservation of everything useful, came something stranger still. Welcome to the part nobody planned. The monastery was not a laboratory. It was not an institution designed to produce new things. Quite the opposite. It was designed to preserve old things, to repeat them, to perform the same prayers at the same hours on the same stone floor until the stone wore smooth, and the prayers continued anyway. Novelty was not the point. Novelty, in certain readings of the rule, was a form of pride, and yet, out of the silence and the cold and the relentless conservation of everything useful, things came. It begins, as most things in the monastery begin, with the bell that rings for matins, the bell that rings for lauds, the bell that rings for prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, and then matins again, cycling through the same sequence it has cycled through since the community was founded, since Benedict wrote the schedule into the rule, since the first abbot decided that the hours required marking and the marking required sound. Someone has to ring the bell on time. This is not a small problem. The sun can be used in daylight, a sundial in the cloister garden, read by the brother assigned to the task, who then walks to the bell rope and pulls it at the correct moment. In the cloud, this does not work. At night, this does not work at all. In the northern abbeys, in the months when the sky is consistently gray and the nights are long, and matins rings at 2 in the morning in complete darkness, the sundial is ornamental. For centuries, the solution was a water clock, vessel filling or draining at a measured rate, with a float that triggered a mechanism at the correct interval. It worked approximately. It required constant monitoring. It drifted. In hard frost, it stopped. The monks needed something more reliable. The monks needed something that had never existed. And the reason they needed it was the bell. The mechanical clock was invented to ring the bells on time. not to organize commerce, not to coordinate armies, not to give the emerging cities of medieval Europe a shared sense of time, which it eventually did, and which eventually restructured human civilization around the concept of the scheduled hour, and which eventually produced the Industrial Revolution and the railway timetable and the modern workday and every meeting that has ever started late. All of that came later. It began with matins. The earliest mechanical clocks, appearing in European monasteries and cathedral churches in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, were not instruments for telling time in the sense of displaying it. They had no face. They had no hands. They had a mechanism, an escapement, a foliot, a set of gears that released energy in controlled increments, and at the correct interval triggered a hammer, and the hammer struck a bell. That was the whole invention, a machine that rang the bell when it was supposed to. The clock's mechanism depended on a single component, without which the entire system would fail. A component so small you could hold it in one hand, and so consequential that its invention changed the experience of time itself. We will come back to the component, but that wasn't the strangest inheritance. The strangest inheritance came from a cellar in France. The escapement is the thing. A small device, a rocking lever, a toothed wheel, the two working against each other in a controlled oscillation that releases the wheel's energy one tooth at a time rather than all at once. Without the escapement, a weight on a rope unwinds instantly. The gears spin. The hammer falls once, and the mechanism is finished. With the escapement, the same weight unwinds across hours, each tooth of the wheel released in sequence, the lever rocking back and forth with the patience of something that does not know it is keeping time and does not need to. This was new. Nothing in the ancient world had used a controlled oscillating mechanism to regulate the release of energy over time. The Greeks had water clocks. The Romans had water clocks. The Islamic world had water clocks of remarkable sophistication. None of them used an escapement, because the escapement requires a specific insight that the problem of timekeeping is not a problem of measurement, but a problem of control. Not how much time has passed, but how slowly can we make it pass. The monks did not publish this insight. They installed it in a tower and attached it to a bell rope and went back to their schedule. The clock spread anyway, because useful things spread, and because the emerging cities of 13th and 14th century Europe had their own reasons to want a shared public time that was not dependent on the sun. Town clocks appeared, clock faces appeared, for the people who could not hear the bell from where they were standing. The hour became a unit that could be bought and sold, which it had not previously been. The monastery had organized its days around the divine office, around the 7 prayer hours that structured everything else. The medieval city began organizing its days around the clock. The shape was identical. The content had changed entirely. And somewhere in the transition, in the moment when time became a public resource managed by a mechanism rather than a community practice maintained by a bell, something shifted in the way human beings understood what an hour was for. The monks had rung the bell. The world had heard it differently. And here is the part that the monks themselves would not have predicted. They had also, in the course of solving their other problems, invented several things they were not trying to invent. The preservation of Greek and Roman medical knowledge, the texts that survived because monks copied them in cold rooms, not because the monks found them spiritually useful, but because copying was the work, and the work did not discriminate between texts, fed directly into the medical schools of Salerno and Bologna in the 11th and 12th centuries. Those schools produced the first systematic European medicine since Rome. The monks had not been practicing medicine. They had been copying it. The quill had been the instrument. The cold room had been the condition. The schedule had been the reason. In an abbey in the Champagne region of France, sometime in the latter half of the 17th century, A Benedictine lay brother named Pierre Pérignon was assigned to the Cellarium. He was, by the accounts that survive, exceptionally good at his job. His particular responsibilities included the abbey's wine, the pressing, the aging, the bottling, and the management of a problem that the abbey's winemakers had been fighting for years. Champagne's climate was cold enough that fermentation sometimes stopped in autumn before it was complete, resumed in spring when the bottles had already been sealed, and produced inside those sealed bottles a secondary fermentation that the winemakers considered a defect. The wine went cloudy. The bottles occasionally exploded. Pérignon did not eliminate the problem. He learned to control it. He selected grape varieties, blending from different plots to produce a consistent base. He developed a method of clarifying the wine before bottling. He experimented with the thickness of the glass, thicker bottles that could contain the secondary fermentation's pressure without exploding. He used cork stoppers, which held the seal better than the cloth and oil plugs previously used, and which also contained the carbonation that the secondary fermentation produced. The carbonation, the bubbles, the thing that had been considered a defect. Pérignon did not invent sparkling wine in a moment of inspiration. He spent years making the defect consistent, and then containable, and then reproducible, and then he served it to his abbot, and according to one account, repeated often enough to have the quality of legend rather than record, which is the appropriate level of confidence to apply to it. He said something like, "I am drinking stars." Whether he said it or not, the wine existed. The Abbey of Saint Pierre de Hautevillers sold it. It eventually left the abbey, as useful things do. The escapement, the copied texts, the sparkling wine. The hospital, the monastic infirmarium, the first systematic institution in medieval Europe for the ongoing care of the sick, which the rule had mandated and the abbeys had built and maintained across 6 centuries, which became the template for everything that followed. They were not supposed to speak. They were not supposed to own anything. They were not supposed to want. And out of that arrangement, the silence, the cold, the haircloth on the stone floor, the shoes redistributed before the grave was finished, the bell rung at 2 in the morning in complete darkness, the quill moving across the vellum in a room with no fire, came the clock, the hospital, the sparkling wine, the preserved knowledge of the ancient world. It wasn't ambition. It was Tuesday. If you're still watching, that means you made it all the way through the ancient Rome with me. So thank you for staying. And if you didn't, that's kind of perfect, because these stories were never meant to be rushed. They're meant to linger slowly in the background until your mind lets go. So whether you're still here or already asleep, I'll see you in the next one.